Today we are wrapping up our series that we've been on for the last 3 weeks called The Case for Bad Choices. I know it's kind of a strange title for a series, but as you for those of you who have been with us through the whole thing so far, you kind of hopefully are starting to get it. The idea is that God can use even the worst circumstances, even the darkest moments in our lives, to do something amazing, to breathe something new. The prophet Isaiah puts it this way. He says that he will give you beauty for ashes. He makes all things new. So that's kind of where the whole series has been going. And kind of one of the underlying premise of the series is the concept of you paint your life in this earth, on earth. It's not so much your salvation. Your salvation is because of Jesus, but the kind of life you have on this earth really does get defined by the way that you respond to the incredible lows and incredible high moments of your life. The way that you respond is kind of the way that you paint, that kind of develops you into who you are. So that's been the whole concept of the series. And really, the principle behind the whole thing is sort of that sometimes we don't understand why hard things happen to us, but the Bible tells us that the reason these things happen to us is because it does produce something in us. And something should come out of those things. So we're just going to get right into it. If you would open up your Bibles with me to 1 Peter 5, verse 10. Now, we have been wrestling with the same verse this entire series, and again, this is the last time we're going to look at it. Peter says this, after you've suffered a little while, after you've had fun suffering for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Now, what we've been saying, we've been focusing on this last word, establish. It's the Greek word, the meliamo, and it means to lay the foundation or to make stable. It's the same word that the writer of Hebrews uses in Hebrews 1:10 when he says, you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth from the beginning. So, of course, at that moment, we went back to the beginning, and if you read Genesis 1 and Genesis 1:2, if you read it in Hebrew, it reads that God, essentially, he created life out of chaos. So everything was chaos, and out of that, he was able to create life. But for reasons that sometimes can be hard for us to understand in our human minds and our human capacities, in the same way that God created life out of chaos, in the same way that he laid the foundation of the whole earth, our foundations in life, in developing us, seems to happen through suffering. And that's a hard thing to wrap your mind around. You wonder, why would that be? Why build a foundation on something like suffering? I love the way that Paul David Tripp puts it. He says it this way. He says, God will take you where you have not chosen to go in order to produce in you that which you cannot produce on your own. And do you know what the Bible calls that? Grace. But it's not a cool drink, and it's not a soft pillow. There are times when we're crying out, where is the grace of God? When we're getting it. It's not the grace of relief. That is to come. Right now, what we need is the grace of refinement. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount series that we finished a few weeks ago, we talked a lot about refinement. Refinement is the process of removing impurities from an object so that it can actually be used for its purpose, for the purpose that it was created for. So God is leading us. He's leading all of us somewhere that we can't go on our own. He's refining us all. And if you would allow me today to take you on a little bit of a journey, it's going to be a lot different. But I would love to take you guys on this journey kind of through the way that God has been refining Dawn and I for the last 5 years of our lives, particularly in the last 4 years that we were in New York City before we got here. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to dive into it. Heavenly Father, Jesus, we thank you for the opportunity to come together and serve you and worship you and wrestle with the scriptures, Father God, and wrestle with life and how complicated it all gets so very often for us all, Lord. Father God, I pray that you just constantly breathe reminders to us, Lord, that you give us beauty for ashes, that you make all things new, that you are on the throne even when we don't understand what's going on. Holy Spirit, right now I pray that you would speak through me, that everything you would have me to say, let me say that, Lord, and let everything else just fall to the ground. before it ever even comes out of my mouth. We love you and we thank you, and it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. In the fall of 2012, there was a storm in New York. And the city closed all the bridges. The mayor gets on TV and he says, everybody who lives in this region, and in the Rockaways, which was where we lived, he says, you need to evacuate. You need to leave right now. That you have about 2 hours to get off the peninsula and be gone. Leave immediately. But nobody left. Among nobody included our family, who had just moved there 2 months ago. We'd moved there from Manhattan thinking, we could move to the beach for cheaper, more space. That's just New York. It's backwards from everywhere else. You get a way better spot with an ocean view for way less than you'd get for a tiny hole-in-the-wall apartment in Manhattan. So we thought, we'll go there. We planned on leaving because we're normally relatively smart about things like that. And we have kids, and we had 2 at the time, and so we planned on leaving. But we got home from church that day to gather our things to leave, and all of our neighbors were like, don't leave. They said the same thing last year, the same thing. There's a hurricane last year. They made everybody leave, and nothing happened. And what little damage there was caused because we weren't there. Just stay. It was a false alarm last year. But it was not a false alarm in 2012. We watched outside our window as our streets literally became the ocean. On our street, there's 4 blocks between the Atlantic Ocean and the Jamaica Bay. And eventually the water rose so high that it met in the middle. The ocean and the bay met. The ocean and the bay became one. And we were right in the middle of it. So Dawn and I, what we did was the water kept rising and rising. We were on the 3rd floor, so we thought we were going to be fine, but we weren't positive because it got really, really high. And so we gathered all of our kids together. There was the 4 of us. Fiona hadn't been born yet. So we gathered them all together, and we sat on the bed. We lit some candles, and we just sort of tried to be a family because all the power had gone out. The power went out on the entire peninsula. So we're all just kind of sitting there just trying to comfort the kids and make sure everybody's all right. And then at one point, in the middle of the night, and all at almost the same time, in unison, began ringing the sounds of car alarms going off all over the place, just nonstop, hundreds and hundreds of them. Beep, beep, beep. Exactly. Do you ever sit in the quiet of your peaceful homes and suddenly your neighbor's car alarm goes off? It's such a disruption to our peaceful lives, isn't it? Such a disruption. You want nothing more than for that beeping to stop. You're like, you can maybe wait it out a minute. It's like beep, beep, and you're like sitting there like, somebody shut that off. And then they don't shut it off. And then you get really annoyed. Then after like a minute, you're like sticking your head out the window. Will somebody turn off that alarm? What is going on? Well, you want nothing more than it to go away. Have you been there? But it didn't go away that night. It did not stop that night. And as the water rose and rose and rose, the batteries began to grow faint in these cars, and they were submerged with water. The frequencies of these beeps began to become distorted and began to change because they were completely underwater. And it got distorted and really creepy and eerie sounding, all really symbolizing the few minutes left in each of these vehicles' lives. And eventually the sounds faded, and each and every vehicle on that entire peninsula had met its demise. But those were just cars. Now, this won't do any justice because it's horribly blurry and it was very, very dark that day. But out our window was pure black besides red. All we could see out our window was fires in every single direction. And the fact that, so houses were burning down all over the place, and the problem was the fact that the streets had become the oceans. The fire trucks couldn't get to these fires, so they just kept bouncing from house to house to house to house. It just kept spreading. Now, the fear of that fire spreading to our house kept me up most of the night. Eventually, I fell asleep. somehow had the peace to fall asleep, and then we woke up, and the water was all gone in the morning. But when we woke up and we went outside, and Don and I started walking around, the only way that we could describe it was it felt like we were characters in the movie The Book of Eli. Here's a little bit of an idea. The whole town was filled with sand. Every basement was flooded. Every first floor was flooded. Some had water damage to the second floor. Boats were crashed into houses. There was no phone service. There were looters all over the place who came out as soon as the water cleared and stole everything that they could possibly get their hands on. Everybody was on high alert. Everybody was anxious. Everybody was aware. Everybody was awake all the time trying to figure out, to try to protect their things. Firefighters were still putting out fires the next day and the next day and even several days after that. The aerial view on Google Maps shows our neighborhood the day before. This is October. The hurricane was October 28th. On October 27th, there was even some people on the beach still. Everything was green. Everything had life. The next day, it looked like this. Sand, destruction, where grass and life was the day before. If you were to look at an aerial picture of Breezy Point, one of the neighborhoods in the Rockaways where we lived, this is what it looked like after over 100 homes burnt down just over and over and over again. You couldn't get to them. So now there was now just plots of land where homes that were really nice homes once were. So we were walking around that day. We woke up, we walked around, and everything was just chaos. Because there was no service. You couldn't even get a vehicle on the peninsula for it was a couple of days. Nobody could really go anywhere. Everybody's cars were completely dead. So we started walking around on these sandy streets and kind of gather our thoughts around this reality that, life is probably going to be a bit different for our family for a little while. But as we began to do that, another picture began to get painted as we looked around as what was going on. It was a picture of unity and of community and of neighbors coming out of their powerless homes and working together, one home at a time, to get the water out. They would siphon the water to save the homes before the mold set in, but it took several of them to do it. And so suddenly something about this strange little town on the beach near New York City seemed to have gotten stronger. And just like when the ocean and the bay met the day before, the townspeople came together. They became one, because everybody needed each other. And everybody wanted to help each other. And it was really, really beautiful and amazing. Now, a few months later, I was sitting at the beach on it was like a warm winter day, or almost spring, and I just went to the beach, and I overheard some locals talking. And this is what one said to the other. They said to me, "Since the storm, this town hasn't been the same." I walked to a hardware store one day to get a screwdriver. Believe it or not, I actually had to get a screwdriver. I didn't have anybody I could call to help me unscrew my computers back then, so I had to go get my own screwdriver. And no, I still don't really have that. But I had to get a screwdriver. I went to this hardware store, and it was boarded up months later. And a man was sitting outside, and he said to me, "Oh, since the storm, they haven't opened back up. I doubt they ever will." I saw my neighbor across the street, and I asked him, "Hey, how are you doing?" He said, "You know what, Jacob? Since the storm, we haven't been able to use a lot of our house. We haven't been able to use the basement. Half our first floor is still not active. There's just not a lot we can do still." One thing we've been saying this entire series is this, and it could not be more true than in this particular instance. Our lives tend to be defined by our victories and our tragedies, by our highs and our lows, and how we respond to those things. This entire town described its lives on a timeline based around Hurricane Sandy, just like we would describe time as being AD or BC, BC or AD. Their lives were one way. But then now their lives are another way since the storm. I remember the day after the hurricane, I spoke to an elderly woman on the beach who was in tears. And I'll never forget what she said to me. She looked at me and she said these words. She said, "Haven't we been through enough?" You see, the Rockaways, this town that we lived in, and we didn't know anything about it going into it besides that it was on the beach. But the Rockaways are home to more firefighters and more police officers than anywhere in the entire region, in the entire New York City area. So when terrorists flew planes into the Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, and the firefighters and the police officers rushed in when everybody else rushed out, it was the Rockaways that lost more fathers, sons, brothers, friends than anywhere else in the entire city, than any other community in the entire city. Then, just 2 months later, on November 12th, 2001, American Airlines Flight 587 literally crashed into the Bell Harbor neighborhood of the Rockaways. Everybody on the plane was killed. 5 people on the ground were killed. Haven't they been through enough? On the end of the street that we lived on was a small memorial to one of the firefighters who had passed away in 9/11. His brother lived 2 doors down from where we lived. And when the storm rushed in and it ripped that memorial out of the ground and it put it somewhere on the other side of the peninsula, you better believe that brother woke up the next morning and he went and he looking for that memorial. And he found it. And then he set it up in his front yard. Why? Because it's more than just a memorial to a man who sacrificed selflessly for somebody else. It's a reminder to an entire community that we've been through enough. And we need those reminders sometimes. Reminders that say, hey, you know what? We really went through it back there. That was really intense. I don't know why we went through that, but for whatever reason, we went through it. And for whatever reason, we made it through. And here we are now, for this moment, in this time, for this community, for these people, and we got to figure out why. There's a story in the Bible about a king who loved to throw these extravagant parties. And these parties lasted for months and months and months and months. They were crazy. And one day, in the middle of one of these parties, when the Bible says that the king, he said that his heart was merry with wine, he called for his wife. He said, send for my wife and have her come and dance for my friends, my guests at my party. Now, you can only imagine what type of dancing this probably was based on her response. She did not feel comfortable doing this. And not wanting to be humiliated at the hand of her drunk husband, the queen refused. And so the king, in his anger, he says, well, she refused me. She's no longer even fit to be queen, so he sent her away. And he said, find me a new queen. So the king's officers, they begin to look for a new queen. And a couple of things I'm going to tell you this. Bible stuff are super disturbing until you, but this is what happened. So basically, the officers then gather all the virgins in the entire land. They gather them all. And they prepare them all for months to have one night with the king. And whoever pleases the king most gets to be the new queen. And among those virgins was a young lady named Esther, who was Jewish. But Esther did not disclose that she was Jewish because she had an uncle named Mordecai who said, don't tell them that you're Jewish. But she's one of the girls who prepares for one night with the king, and as fate would have it, Esther wins. She won, so she was going to be made queen, and she was made queen. Now, simultaneously, at the same time as all this was happening, the king also appointed a man named Haman, the Agagite, to be his right-hand man above everybody else. And one day, Haman the Agagite went out and he starts demanding that everybody bow down to him and everybody worship him. Now, he had the king's approval to do this. Now, he says everybody bow down and pay homage to me is what it said. It wasn't actually worship. It was just bow down and show me respect is basically what he was saying. And but Esther's uncle Mordecai refused to pay homage to Haman, saying he won't do it because he's Jewish. Now, this wasn't like I'm bowing down to you like you're a god. At least from everything I understand, it was more just an act of respect. And basically what Haman was saying was, I don't acknowledge your authority. I bet Mordecai was saying that to Haman. I don't acknowledge your authority here. And he cited the reason being that he's Jewish. Now, he told Esther not to even tell them that she was Jewish, but yet he's doing this saying, I'm going to do this because I'm Jewish. I don't really understand why, but the text says that Haman was so mad that Mordecai would not bow that he said this. It says this, Haman was filled with fury. He was so mad that he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, and because he knew that the people of Mordecai, he knew that he was Jewish, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, all of them, the people of Mordecai throughout the whole entire kingdom. And the king signed off on it. Now, perhaps, that king would not have gone along with that had he known his wife was Jewish. But you live and you learn. So Esther and Mordecai are now talking, and they're talking about the gravity of the situation. And Mordecai's like, you got to do something, Esther. And Esther tries to explain to her uncle that even though she's the queen, she hadn't seen the king in over a month. And the way that it works in that day is if she were to go before the king and the king did not wish to see her, she would instantly be put to death immediately. So basically, Esther's like, Uncle Mordecai, the stakes are very high. So of course, Mordecai responds by raising the stakes even more. And he says this, and many of you may know this passage. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Now I can imagine Esther, after the inspirational words of her uncle, just thinking, such a time as this, Uncle Mordecai, you got us into this mess. You totally got us into this mess. You were disrespectful to your leader, and now he wants to kill all of us. But somebody had to do something. The night of that hurricane, I remember I was just continuously reflected. See, before we moved to the Rockaways, most people were kind of like, that's kind of weird. It's kind of far from Manhattan. It's in Queens, so naturally, just because it's in Queens, you obviously shouldn't live there because Queens is like the grossest part of New York. That's kind of the vibe. But Rockaway is a little bit different, and we really liked it. But the whole time I'm thinking, man, maybe why did we move here? Why did we do this? I remember calling my dad. I'm calling Pastor Brad. I'm just having these conversations, like trying to live in all this. Like, God, what happened? Why did we do this? It started to feel like the entire thing was just this series of bad decisions. Felt like a really bad choice. Why would the mayor tells us to leave and we stay? Really bad choice. But then the next morning, I woke up and I realized maybe it wasn't our decision at all. Maybe we were there for such a time as this. Maybe God used our stubborn and our insistent hearts for another chance to show up. Not only just in our town, but in all of our lives, and even in our church, and in the way that it was going to position our church, and in the way that we were going to be able to reach the people before us, because it was because we were there that it set us up to do some of the most amazing restoration that our church had ever been a part of. We got to be a part of something amazing in the weeks that followed that storm. We got to rebuild people's houses. We got to pray with people. We got to comfort people. We got to feed people. We were able to be on the front lines of restoration. See, in life, some things are within your control. Others are not. I think of Dawn's sister, my sister-in-law, Natalie, who, in a matter of only a few years ago, just over a matter of a few months, she went through a really brutal separation from her husband. They had 2 daughters, 2 little girls, and eventually a divorce. And that's hard enough, right? In the middle of that separation, their 2-year-old daughter gets diagnosed with leukemia. Now, thank God that cancer was treatable. She's on the other side of that. Everything's much better. But it just felt like for those years that followed, those couple of years, it felt like she just went from storm to storm to storm to storm, and it didn't really make much sense. So finally, when they kind of got to a place where she could kind of do something different, we encouraged her to move to New York with us because we were living in New York, and we were like, you know what? Come someplace new, start over. It's an opportunity to be anybody you want to be in a new place, allow something new to be birthed out of all of this pain that you've been feeling for the last few years, all of this pain that you've had to fight through over the last few years. So all of that then, probably, I would think, must have made it easy for her when the single mom with 2 children moves to the Rockaways 1 week before this hurricane hits. It must have made it easy for this mother of 2 kids to be dubbed officially homeless when the basement apartment that she had rented and was about to move into literally the next day was flooded. This was the door to her apartment. Hasn't she been through enough? I guess that's what James meant. At least I wonder, probably this is what James meant when he says, "Dear brothers and sisters, whenever trouble comes your way, let it be an opportunity for joy. For when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be strong in character and ready for anything." Now, when I think about what happened to Don's sister, I wonder, would she have been able to handle being homeless in New York City after just moving there? I mean, New York City is a beast of its own, guys. It's a whole different world. And we literally all were kind of having to stay with different people, and she didn't know hardly any of them, and she had her kids with her, and she's bouncing from house to house to house. I knew her before all that happened. I don't think she would have lasted a week. No offense to her. I don't think she would have been home in the second week. But now to this day, she's still in New York. And she finished college, and she's teaching for the first time this year in the New York public school system, living this dream that God birthed in her heart after she stepped out in faith. Guys, nobody likes the valley moments. Nobody likes them. Nobody wants them. We don't like going through hard times. But just like James says, your endurance has a chance to grow. Paul puts it this way: when you go through them, it produces something in you. Everybody wants to be on the mountaintop. They want the high. I don't know anybody who's like, I love feeling like I couldn't possibly get any worse. I love it, like knowing that this can't get any lower. Like this, I don't think I could make a bigger mess of this. I don't think that's where most people like to be. But the truth is, guys, where the mountaintops have great views, and it's fun to go up there, and when you get to the top, you're going to find that not much grows there. The truth is, fruit grows in the valleys. Vegetation primarily grows in the valleys, and so it is in our lives. I have this guitar. And this is a guitar we painted a long time ago, basically to remind me. I put this picture on it. I painted it like years and years ago, but I recently, about when we were living in Rockaway, I put this picture on the guitar. Just so every time I picked it up, I would see all my friends and I would remember them, because basically I used to play a lot of music, and these are some of the people that I played with a lot of. And so it was just sort of this goofy group of people. And I wanted to, when I played it, I like remembering things. So this is that picture. In the back is Andrew. The front is Drew, and this amazing-looking young man with the white hat on is me. Tony's in the front, Dave in the back behind me, then John, Jordan, and Michael. These are some of my closest friends. Now, in Rockaway, we were expecting Fiona, our third daughter, any day to be born, one Saturday morning. And I asked Dawn's sister to come watch the kids, and I took Dawn on a walk on the beach, and we walked for hours and hours, like a really long walk on the beach, because it was probably going to be like the last one we were going to get for a while. And it was a beautiful morning. And my phone rang, and I looked at it, and it's Tony calling. And I hadn't talked to Tony in a while, and I really kind of wanted to see Tony, but I wanted to talk to Tony, but I really wanted to spend this time with my wife, because if you're married, you understand those times are like gold when you have kids. You don't get a lot of them, so I put the phone back in my pocket. We kept walking, we kept talking, we kept dreaming. The phone kept ringing, vibrating, over and over and over. And then finally, we get back by our house. We're still at the beach, but we're kind of getting ready to go in. And I pull out my phone thinking to maybe see a missed call and a voicemail, but I have like a string of texts from just about everybody that I know, all saying the same thing. Tony said this: "Hey man, Drew passed away last night." Another friend texted me saying, Jacob, tell me this is a joke. This isn't real. I just talked to him yesterday. This can't be. I just talked to him. Now, to say that in this moment I was devastated would have been the biggest understatement in the entire world. The biggest one. Of all of my friends, Drew is probably the most generous, nicest, most loving person pretty much that we ever knew. At our wedding, he got us the most expensive gift on our wedding registry. Not because he had a bunch of money, but because he knew nobody else was going to get us that. And he just loves being generous. He just loved that. He loved people. So after he died, I took this picture. I took this picture of a picture, and I put it on Facebook. And it wasn't long before Facebook was filled with pictures just like that of Drew. Because where memories like this, they don't actually take us back to where we once were. And they can't actually take us back to it. For some people, especially in situations like this, the old still frames of the way that things used to be are all we have left. Now, I want to remind you of what we talked about 2 weeks ago. I'm not going to go into as much detail this time, about when our youngest daughter, Fiona, was born. Because only a few days after he died, she was born. And as you all know, I delivered her in our house. It was a home birth. It was delivered by me. There were no doctors. And that was not on purpose. The midwife just didn't make it to the delivery on time. Her job is to get there, but she didn't get there. And her job was to get there and deliver the baby. My job was to make dinner for everybody. And because she didn't get there and I delivered the baby, I asked, you know what, I did your job. You need to do my job. So when she got there, I had her make us all dinner. She obliged because I think she wanted her insurance money, and she realized I probably should have gotten that insurance check. But here's the point. That moment when I was delivering that child in our house, it was so stressful. It was total chaos. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. Unless you're like a doctor person who loves delivering babies, delivering a baby is like the hardest thing, the most stressful, most chaotic thing you could ever do. It's so uncertain. I had no idea what was going on. But suddenly, in the middle of all that, Fiona was in my arms. And she's breathing, and she's crying, and she's actually alive. So I had this amazing opportunity to deliver my daughter in my house, and nobody was there, just Dawn and I. A moment that went from the absolute highest stress anybody could ever have, immediately followed by this greatest sense of pride I'd ever felt in my entire life. But the contrasting realities of those 2 weeks will forever stay in my mind. They'll forever be in my mind. Nothing ever hit me harder than when my friend Drew died. Nothing ever affected me more in like a way that, oh man, I don't even know how to process this. I don't know how to handle this. And the fact that I couldn't go to his funeral because it was so close to when my daughter was going to be born, that weighed really, really, really heavily on me. But when the moment came to have Fiona, I wasn't thinking about any of that anymore. All I was thinking about was her. And so suddenly I have Fiona in my arms, and suddenly in my life, in the midst of death and sorrow and pain and sadness and uncertainty, an end was beginning, and excitement and joy and anticipation and love and life. Because that is what Jesus does. He makes all things new. As the prophet Isaiah says, he will give you beauty for ashes. And again, as much as my heart may have ached leading up to that moment, when that moment came, all I was thinking about was Fiona. Rewind just a few months earlier, and I went with Dawn and our 2 kids to an ultrasound tech in Brooklyn to see pictures of Fiona growing in Dawn's belly. And it was one of those doctor's visits where it took literally hours. Like you think you're going to be in and out in 30 minutes, and literally 3.5 hours later, you haven't even seen the doctor. And the kids are so anxious, and they're going absolutely crazy. They're restless. I'm stressed out. It's frustrating. Finally, the doctors called Dawn in. So I start to go with her, and they stop her. And they're like, oh, you can't go in. I'm like, well, I should have just stayed home at the house with the kids if I can't go in. I want to see my kid. They're like, you can't go in. You need to stay out. So now I'm all alone with these two restless, psychotic little girls climbing around, jumping, running, screaming, crying, making me absolutely crazy. Making everybody absolutely crazy. When this lady, who had to have been at least 80 years old, kind of sneaks in and just starts talking to me and starts asking me all these questions about our kids. She says, well, how old are they? What are their names? Oh, are you raising them here in Brooklyn? Is that why you named one of them Brooklyn? And right as that conversation was drawing to a close, and I was trying to sort of work my way out of it and ease back into the chaos that was my life at that moment, that woman looked at me with eyes that had seen more life than anybody that I'd ever known, pretty much. And she put my entire world into perspective when she said to me, "Sir, you are luckier than the guy who won $365 million in the lottery last night." See, the chaos didn't matter. She reached into that chaos and she pulled out a reality. God entrusted me with something way bigger than myself. He entrusted me with the lives of these precious children. He entrusted me with life beyond my own. And I'm wondering about this woman. I'm wondering, is she saying this out of remembering how great it was when she was a parent? Is she saying this out of guilt that maybe she was not a good parent? Is she saying this out of maybe never being able to have kids, and so she wishes that she could, and it took her back there? Where was this coming from? Was she just trying to put my world into perspective so I wouldn't miss what's right in front of me? Because, guys, it's easy to miss that when you're chasing them around the doctor's office. It's easy to miss that when everybody's looking at you thinking, that's the worst dad in the world. And sometimes I feel that way. I start to get discouraged, right? And I start to think, like, I'm so distracted, I can't possibly be a good dad. But then this happens. My iPhone runs out of space. And I know that may sound like a very strange wake-up call, but its value is priceless. See, until recently, the affordable iPhone was very, very small. Your pictures ran out a lot. And in order, you didn't have this big fancy pants iCloud thing that backed everything up. So when your phone ran out, you had to plug it into your computer. And when you plugged it into your computer, this would pop up. And you'd start seeing all of these moments that had just been made in the last couple of months. And it actually used to look more like this. And it would pop up and you'd see the full frames in a second at a time, picture, 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 and suddenly I'm granted a front row seat into the last 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months of my life. And I remember we did all these amazing things. We went to Disneyland. We went to Cedar Point. We got to do all these crazy things. We went to the beach. We had fun with these kids. We had great everyday moments. And sometimes all you got to do is just remember that, you know what, your kids are going to be okay. My family's going to be okay. I am going to be okay. That we're creating fresh and new memories every single day. And as long as my phone keeps filling up, then that means that there are still memories being created. There are memories to dump. And there are memories that some of them we're going to always remember. Because sometimes it feels like we just put our kids through so much. I mean, for Dawn and I, we moved them here from New York. Their best friends were their cousins. They saw them every day. That wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for us to say, hey, you know what, we're going to give up everything that we've built. Because when we moved to New York, we didn't think we were moving to New York to step on to something else. We thought we were going to build something that we were going to be a part of forever. That was what we had envisioned when we first did it. But God had other plans, and he revealed himself in other ways. But it's hard to build and build and build and then get to this point where you realize, I think I'm stepping out of this on the cusp of everything I've worked for coming to life. And to not be able to stay and be around and witness the fruit of that labor was very, very difficult. And it's easy to wonder, God, why do you put us through all that? Only to move us somewhere else and start all over. Why build a foundation like that? But then I realized that's the Jesus foundation. It's the same way that God established the whole world, and it's the same way that Jesus brought life to everybody by taking on our chaos. There's this beautiful moment in the Bible in John chapter 13 when Jesus is having like this last meal with the disciples. And what happens is, the Bible says that Jesus takes off his outer garments. He stands up from his meal. He takes off his outer garments, and then he begins to wash the disciples' feet. And he goes from disciple to disciple. And when he gets to Peter, Peter says, "No, Jesus, you can't wash my feet. I should be washing your feet." And Jesus says something to Peter that it's so easy to miss because he doesn't let Peter do it, even though that would have made sense, it seems like. Jesus is God. But he says this, he says, "Peter, you don't understand what I'm doing, but someday you will." And it's easy to read that and miss that what Jesus is telling his best friend is that there is a much bigger picture than just the current circumstances. Yes, it maybe would have made more sense in the natural for Peter to wash Jesus' feet, but Jesus had to build a life of service, to lay a better foundation, a foundation that is now what's going to save the entire world. And suddenly, when you think of it like that, and you think of your life in perspective with Jesus and with the gospel, you realize you have something worth suffering for. You have something worth going through some really hard moments sometimes for. And guys, if it means telling more people about Jesus at my expense, sign me up. There's nothing I want to do more. But he might put us through a refining process in the process of it. But the truth is that at the end of that process, he's going to use every last bit of your refined life. Let me give you an example from history as I begin to close. It's the story of the Great Chicago Fire. On October 8th, the 8th of October, 1871, there was a fire that was believed to have been started in the barn. This is a barn of a man named Patrick O'Leary. I know a guy named John O'Leary. Patrick O'Leary is the guy from this. From a man named Patrick O'Leary. And it spread and spread and spread from this barn to what is now known as the Great Chicago Fire. Now, a man named Horatio Gates Spafford, and he had a wife named Anna. They were very prominent. He was a very prominent businessman in Chicago during that time. But the problem is he had all of his assets, almost every one of his assets, tied up in real estate. And so his family lost almost everything to this fire. But of course, like a good businessman, he began to rebuild. 2 years later, after rebuilding and rebuilding and fighting and fighting and fighting, he finally realized, you know what, our family needs a break. We need a vacation, which I can tell you I didn't go through anything that dramatic, but even through the hurricane, it was like, you know what, we needed a vacation after that. I understand that, needing to step back. So they said, you know what, we need to step back, we need to take a vacation, we need to start focusing on what we do have and not everything that we lost, not everything that we're even rebuilding right now. And he was friends with D.L. Moody, who's a very famous preacher who was going to be preaching in England. So they said, let's go to England and let's hear D.L. Moody preach. So they got ready to go. He, his wife, their 4 daughters. And they're about to leave, and just before they departed, something came up in his business, something that he had to tend to. So he sends his wife and his 4 daughters ahead, promising, I won't be far behind. So the 5 Spafford women boarded a ship called the Villa du Havre, headed towards England. And in a tragedy of the worst kind, the Villa du Havre crashed into an iron sailing vessel, and hundreds of people were killed. Some were rescued, but there was little information for a very long time. Who made it, who didn't. Horatio knew there was a crash, but he didn't hear anything. He just waited in Chicago, waiting and waiting and waiting to hear. And then finally, he receives a telegram from his wife, 2 words long. Saved alone. His 4 daughters were all gone. And his wife was waiting on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean for him. So, of course, he then set sail for England to meet and hold his wife, utterly heartbroken, utterly destroyed, just devastated, knowing what she must be going through, what she went through. He just wanted to be there so they could be together. And it was while he was at sea that he penned the words to a psalm that he called Villa du Havre, that he named after the ship that took his family away from him forever, his daughters away from him forever, a ship that he put them all on, but he did not board himself. And that song is now known as "It Is Well With My Soul," when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. He took the worst situation that could have possibly happened, and he turned it into a song that the whole world now takes comfort in. The whole world knows. Years ago, I wrote a song. I wrote a song once. I wrote a song a few times. I've written a lot of them. And it didn't have that kind of a reach. I wish it would have. It didn't have a reach like that, but it did have a reach that I didn't expect it to have. See, when we were living in Los Angeles, we did this illustrated sermon with our pastor. It was called Altar, and I wrote a song called "Something Must Change." And the entire purpose of this song, the entire concept was that something must change in us if we're going to actually change them out there. The change has to start with the church. The change has to start in our lives. And the response that day in Los Angeles was very powerful. It was amazing. But it does not come close to the response that would come later. Because after my friend Drew died, his family reached out and they said, "We want to play that at his funeral." Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people at this young man's funeral. And what they did was they literally just asked them all to sit reverently, sit silently, and listen. Because our world is so broken, and something's going to change, needs to change, or else we're going to be burying a lot more kids. And so we all just sat, I wasn't there, but they all just sat there, and they listened to the words of the song, and the gospel was preached to all of these broken hearts in this moment. And it's so amazing to me because I was not there, but suddenly I was there. And suddenly, just like what happened, we talked about with our discipleship video, when you create something for one thing and it does something different, suddenly a piece of art that was created for an entirely different purpose is now serving a new purpose. And was in a small way helping bring hope to so many broken lives. And God used my handprint to be his vessel for that. And guys, that's the mystery of art. That's why response is so important. There's a mystery to it. It knows no boundaries. That's the mystery of life when Jesus has a hold of you. And the fruit that it bears, it knows no boundaries. You can be in one place and a million places all at once. I can be in New York and I can be here all at once. I can be in Los Angeles and it can be at a funeral all at once. It can be at a funeral bringing comfort and at a birth bringing newness all at once. And that's the kind of impact that I want my life to have. That's the kind of impact that I want Courage Church to have in this community. And who knows, guys, if we were not created for such a time as this. Remember the story of Esther? Well, Haman was an Agagite. Mordecai was a Jew. And in the book of Samuel, there's this very bizarre moment. And again, I know this sounds awful, but we're going somewhere different today. God commands Saul, who's a Jew, to wipe out the Agagites, wipe out the entire population of the Agagites. And Saul's in a position to do it, but he does not do it. He wipes out all of them besides one. He spares King Agag. And he spares some livestock. And so generations later, the Jews, Saul's people, were now being threatened with extinction at the hand of an Agagite. A group of people that were not even supposed to be around anymore. Now, why does that matter to this story? See, guys, Haman should have been a constant reminder to the Jewish people that they did not do what God told them to do. A scar, if you will. a scar that came back to haunt them and literally was threatening them with genocide. But all God saw was another chance to show up. All God saw was another chance to restore it all and to write a better story. And I don't have time right now to get into the entire book of Esther, but when you go home tonight and this week, read it. It's not very long. Read the story. It's amazing. But when you read it knowing this. The entire book of Esther, it could have been avoided had Saul done what he was commanded. It could have been avoided had Mordecai shown respect to Haman, his authority. It could have been avoided had Esther been honest about being Jewish in the first place. What kind of a husband wipes out the entire race of his wife's people, knowing that she's part of that race? He wasn't a very good king, so maybe, but I think it could have helped. But here's the point, guys. God took all of the shortcomings of his people, and he still crafted a beautiful story out of it. A beautiful story of redemption. And hear this, guys. The same God who can take a king, a drunk king, who divorced his wife because she wouldn't dance for his friends, and then turn that into such a time as this moment for a young lady who otherwise was going to be invisible. He's the same God who promised those who mourn in Zion, I will give you beauty for ashes. And he's the same God who's with you and I today in every high and in every low. He's with you in that moment when you hold your baby for the very first time. And he's there at every funeral. He's there at every wedding. And he's with you if you're going through a divorce. In every sickness. He's there in every transition, in every promotion, in every storm. He's there with every lonely heart that goes to sleep each night, praying to wake up whole. And he's with them in the morning when they wake up and they still feel broken. He's with us in the quiet of our peaceful homes that are sometimes disrupted by the sound of the neighbor's car alarm going off in the middle of the night and waking up our kids. Because sometimes we need the disruptions. Sometimes we need the change. Sometimes we need the storms. And the beautiful image the next morning of a city fallen, but a hope rising on the realization that God is about to do something brand new. He's about to paint something beautiful out of everything that you just watched burn. Because how are any of us ever going to get beauty for ashes if nothing ever burns? And even as it's burning, he's with us, painting a picture more grand than our imaginations can possibly imagine. From the things that we thought maybe were going to end us, but in the end are what's carrying us. Because God is in the business of restoring all things back to him. He created life out of chaos, and he can bring life to your messes. I remember the following spring after the hurricane, I ordered some pasta from a little Italian restaurant on Beach 129th Street. It was a pasta that Don and I loved, but I can say with all sincerity that since the storm, it's not been as good. I don't really know why. It's good pasta for a long time. Dawn was out of town, and she was she took the kids, and she went to go visit her grandma. Her grandma didn't have very many more months to live, and she wanted to see her one more time, so she was there with her. So I was by myself, and I wanted to ride my bike, but my bike had been ruined by Hurricane Sandy. But I tried to ride it anyway, so I'm pedaling on this bike, and it's all rusty and really nasty and whatever. I made it most of the way, and then the chain fell off, and I start walking. I get to the block that the pasta place is on. I'm still a little early. So I stopped to look at the housing market on the street because I'm wondering, what did the storm do to the market? Because it was all going up, and then this happened. I wondered. So I stop and I look. But as I'm there, looking at all these pictures, I look, something out of the corner of my eye, I catch this new-looking coffee shop. It looked brand new. It looked so out of place on this really dingy street that had been really roughed up by the storm. And I was like, that looks amazing. And we didn't have a lot of good coffee in Rockaway, so I was really excited about it. I wondered if it was going to be something awesome. So I dropped my bike, and I run to the door, and I swing open the door, and I shout to the lady behind the counter. I say, hey, this place looks Amazing. I've never seen it before. Is it new? And she looked at me and said, no. We've been here for years. But since the storm, we redid everything.